African Ascent, an internationally acclaimed television program which customarily works on cultural, political, and philosophical themes with global implications. Since its move to Melrose, Massachusetts, about 3 years ago, has decided to venture and explore the Melrosian political landscape. Melrose happens to be a city in which I'm currently residing, and I'm increasingly falling in love. As everybody knows, the main attraction of the city is the beautiful main street and its quaint shops and so on. So today, having interviewed an older man about an hour ago, I'm moving now to introduce you to a potential mayor for the city, and will be covering the horizons, the political horizons, the hot button issues, her visions, her plans, the obstacles that she must have faced, having not finished her first term, but challenged by the first term. She is already gumptious, ambitious to look at the possibility of running for the mayorship of the city. Welcome to Afghanistan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, how long have you been in Melrose?
My family moved here in 2013, so about 6 years.
About 6 years.
Yep.
Okay. So you do know the city quite well. I just spoke to Peter Mortimer, who has been in Melrose for 50 years, and listening to him to speak about Melrose by thinking about what it was like 50 years ago against what it is now and what the trajectories are was quite phenomenal. And in your case, of course, you're not only young, but you're also a recent citizen of Melrose.
Yep.
Is it very frightening for you to consider running for the mayorship, considering the fact that you have not lived here sufficiently long? Some people might say, or are you confident?
I'm really excited. As you said in your introduction, Melrose is a place that's really easy to fall in love with.
Yes.
And it's such a welcoming community that honestly, I felt at home right away here and jumped right in to get involved publicly. Prior to moving here, I'm a city planner professionally. So I actually first came to know the city through my planning work, where I kind of got to see it from from the lens of being a regional planner who was
Yes.
working across Greater Boston. And at that point, my family and I weren't yet looking to. We were living in a condo in Cambridge, and we weren't necessarily looking to move out of the city at that point. But I distinctly remember a feeling of driving down Main Street and feeling at home right away the
Yes.
very first time I came here. So a year or two later, when we were looking to buy a home, Melrose was at the top of my list. And soon after moving here, I got really involved in the community right away, both on the professional side through my planning work. I worked with with folks at City Hall on some zoning initiatives, some economic development along the commuter rail corridor, as well as working on a community vision and master plan called Melrose Forward. So that's some things I did kind of under through my role in a consulting capacity for the city. But I also reached out to Mayor Dolan at the time because I was really interested in thinking about how do we put this idea of one community open to all into action. So I ended up becoming appointed to the Melrose Human Rights Commission, where prior to becoming an alderman 2 years ago, I was the vice chair.
That's incredible. I'm quite impressed, in fact. Now, think of the term itself, alderman. There are some sexist implications in the job title itself. How did you manage to qualify yourself for a title that on the surface does not seem to be very inviting? This is a very critical question, so you can dodge it, but you can also take it as a challenge.
I would never dodge a question.
You can. In my show, you can.
So the term itself, my issues with the term alderman were as much sort of that idea of it being gendered, but also the fact that a lot of people in the community, including people who have lived here a long time, couldn't wrap their heads around what that means and what is an alderman.
What is it exactly?
It to me always felt a little bit putting kind of like it's a council of village elders is how it felt to me. Aside from the male aspect of it always sort of felt kind of like my vision for government is inclusive, open, where the folks who serve the community as their legislators, as their executives, have an open door policy. And to me, city council actually reflects that better. We did vote. It would have been, if you had asked me 2 months ago, I think, at that point, maybe it would have felt like a more political question because we hadn't yet voted to change the name, but we have actually voted to change the name. And it's been interesting since that concept was first introduced by one of my colleagues, Jennifer Lemmerman, who's currently the president of the Board of Aldermen, soon to be City Council. She introduced it back in, I want to say 2016. And at that time, it didn't have enough votes from among the body to win. And then it was introduced again a year later, and there was some back and forth. It was a very close call. This time, we were now the last Board of Aldermen in the state. And also, I think just the winds have changed enough where folks who were previously not sure about the name change have now embraced it. And ultimately, it doesn't change the job we do. I think having the title before, I kind of became accustomed to it. So it was fine. And it wasn't ideal. I think more so where I think people felt weird calling me that. I had just gotten used to it. So
that's fine.
I mean, I'm still now that we're on the other side of that decision, I'm struggling to call myself a city councilor, even though I've been waiting for that day for so long.
And it's going to
and someday I won't have to because I'll be mayor.
That's right. Exactly. No question about that. The tremendous opportunities. Now, there are those who may think that it's a bit too early for you to venture running for this office, having been a city councilor, a previous alderman for about a year or two. You haven't finished
so I was elected in November of 2017 and inaugurated in January of 2018. So a little under 2 years, yes.
Yes, under 2 years. Do you think that hesitation is reasonable? Or do you think, in spite of the fact that you've been in there for 2 years, you're such a good student that you might have probably amassed knowledge that might take others 20 years or more?
So I think there's sort of three components to that for me. Let's see if I remember all three. One is this has been a particularly interesting time to be on the Board of Aldermen. Those of us who were newly elected were really kind of thrown into the deep end where on the night of our inauguration, we were dealing with a transition of power where our previous mayor had taken another position, and we were effectively appointing the next mayor to serve out the remainder of the mayoral term. So I got a quick introduction to our city charter. We also were dealing with a difficult budget situation and facing the recent Proposition 2.5 override conversation. So there was a lot, I think, in this 2-year period, there's just been a lot going on in the community that at a different 2-year term, someone may not have had quite all of that, experience packed into 2 years. That said, my experience didn't begin 2 years ago. My entire career, I have worked with local governments. I've worked in city halls. I've also worked for the state and for regional planning agencies doing work where cities and towns governments were my clients, and that has allowed me to really understand best practices, systems, ways of engaging the community. Lots of the different things that I would have to employ as mayor are things that on the job as a city planner I
I
had to deal with on a
see.
daily basis.
I see. So a highly localized experience of being a Melrosian only is not necessarily a sufficient condition for qualifying oneself as a mayor.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of
There
interesting
are
because,
some other.
I think being a city councilor, you can
Mhm.
come from a variety of different backgrounds.
Yes,
And certainly that's technically true for mayor as well.
yes,
But it is ultimately an executive management position
I see.
and requires some knowledge of a whole range of topics, not only the city budget, but and municipal finance, which is something I think I've really delved into with, our budget
Of
situation in the last few
course.
years. But the other things where I've already had experience, which is thinking about how do we maintain a thriving community? How do we weigh options for preserving land while also creating opportunities for new development? How do we deal with the fact that our demographics are changing and making sure we're a welcoming community? How do we deal with being a really hot real estate market while also seeing our housing prices go up and folks who are in fixed incomes feeling more pressure or feeling or renters feeling like they may not be able to afford to stay in the community. So as a planner, I've had to grapple with those sometimes opposing values or difficult decisions and difficult sort of choices throughout my
And
career.
of course, if you were to be elected as a mayor, it is conceivable that you'll get an opportunity, for example, to influence the potential allocations of the $500 million that private developers are planning to allocate to the city of Melrose? Or would that be an allocation
Are,
that
are
is
you talking about
exclusively?
referencing to the $5 million
Yes,
override?
yes,
So a lot of that money, I think is going to go towards creating new staff positions or increasing teacher pay. A lot of that money is spoken for, but there is some flexibility that the remaining, for example, $750,000 that was going towards the school will help us do some things like pay for fire trucks, pay for maybe a library renovation, things that have been kind of kicked, the can has been kicked down the road.
mhm,
I think beyond that, so that's, we're obligated to spend those new monies in a certain way in year one. After when we're looking at next year's budget, we will have an opportunity to revisit some of that, but I think we'll have to also make sure that we're accountable to the voters and what they voted for, which is really supporting our schools. So that's going to continue, but I think this release of pressure that was on our budget is going to help us think more proactively about other things like that could help generate more revenue, like economic development, for
mhm.
example.
What do you think is in the horizon for the city of Melrose?
We have a lot of one, we have changing population. We have seen some recent growth in our population, which is not, one of the things I remember talking to people a lot during conversations during the override is Melrose peaked in population in 1970, and we actually declined in population for a few decades. And in the last 5 to 10 years, we've been creeping back up. So a lot of the student enrollment growth and all of that I see as cyclical, but nevertheless, the combination of being this hot real estate market and having really good schools means Melrose is a really desirable place to be. So we're going to continue to deal with the challenges of accommodating our school population. And to me, it's really important that we remain welcoming, and and that may lend itself to conversations around housing, but weighing that with or having conversations in the community about how do we accommodate students in our schools. Another thing I see is we have a lot of aging infrastructure. This city was predominantly developed in the Victorian era a century ago. And although there have been some really good strategic investments, both in terms of things we don't see, our pipes and things under the roadways, but also the roadways and sidewalks themselves, and our buildings, our fire stations, our police station, our schools, our library, Memorial Hall, City Hall, all of our buildings and facilities are showing lots of signs of wear and tear.
Absolutely.
And
look at the YMCA, for example,
yeah,
to which I go on any given day, particularly if you venture to go there very early in the morning. Finding a parking, unless you decide to park somewhere by shores or somewhere far away, is an issue. This shouldn't necessarily be an issue because the Y is a very well used public space, and both the location and the parking lot spaces require dramatic attention, the way the city of Saugus has done it, for example. I recently decided to move from this Y to Saugus. There is a hidden secret there, a very well run YMCA, in contrast to the one that we have here. And this, in the context of the city of Melrose being chosen as one of the hottest growing cities in the country. How do you think should
so I mean, this is one of the, so this is like an example of maybe a political question I should dodge, which is parking, but I won't, as I said right at the beginning.
No, you can.
So at the beginning, you talked about our vibrant downtown and our main street.
Mm-hmm.
What makes it vibrant is being able to have foot traffic and walking, and honestly having more parking, which I'm not opposed to more parking. I think having spaces in our downtown taken up by parking versus maybe adding density to the development actually can take away from that vibrancy of the walking, quaint, beautiful downtown that we have.
True.
So I think when it comes to parking, what we need to do is look at what are the spaces we have and are they being utilized in a way that allows for folks who are going to the gym in the morning to be able to find a spot conveniently while also really promoting a great pedestrian environment, an environment where it's safe to ride your bike, an environment where someone on a wheelchair won't feel impeded by being able to get around. So I think, when it comes to parking, when you think of the places you like to go visit, going to the gym is one thing, right? And those are things we need to be able to do within our own community. But when you think of the places you like to go out to eat, what you like to do, it's nice when you're in an environment where you can go take a stroll and maybe do some window shopping and all of that. So parking sometimes can be at odds with those other goals.
You are right. Yeah.
So I think we just have to think about how do we manage our parking in a way. Another example I give people when it comes to parking is if you think about when you go to, say, Burlington Mall, for example, think about how gigantic that parking lot is and how gigantic that building is. And even if you parked in a very close spot to your destination, the amount of walking you have to do from your parking spot to that destination is no less than what you would, or no more, no less. The amount you would have to do from the parking lot at a mall to a shop inside a mall compared with the amount of walking you would have to do, say, if you had to park behind City Hall and go to the Y, is not necessarily a big, you may walk further to get inside the mall, is what I'm trying to say. But there isn't that perception of a lack of parking when you're doing it in a mall parking lot in the same way. I mean, I've circled that parking lot as well, and it's not easy, but anyway. Yeah.
And now, of course, you broached this minimally a few minutes ago. Let me return to it now. Housing is a major issue in the city. What are some of the visions that you have to?
Well, so I mean, can I put the question back on you? Like, what do you see as the issues with regards to housing? Because I think a lot of people see the issue as it relates to housing in a lot of different ways, and I'm curious what you're seeing in your experience in the community.
I haven't lived here long enough to be able to give you a reliable perspective, but I'm more than willing to learn from you. So, in what sense do you think is housing a major issue in the city of Melrose?
So
You did address it before.
yeah,
There are
right.
income differentials,
Yep.
the hiking prices of certain housings. You want to expand the demography, and part of expanding it is to make it possible for individuals who'd like to live to Melrose to be able to buy homes that they could afford. To give you an example, I bought a home when I first moved to Melrose. I'll go public for about $435,000. Within 3 years, people are now asking me if they could buy it for $800,000, for example. Of course, I'm privately intrigued by the idea, but as a moral
Right.
philosopher, I'm outraged
Right.
because this is going to come at the expense of other human beings, most particularly the person who sold that property to me. Did not envision that had he waited, he could have sold it for $300,000 more. So I feel as if it's a lottery for me, but a loss for another human being like me. And of course, there are tentacles of similar stories that
Yeah.
are
Right.
rampant in the
Right.
city of Melrose. So, what are your visions of how we could handle this?
Yeah, well, so I mean, I think it's interesting because there's a few different ways to think about it. One is that we're part of the greater Boston region, and there is across our region an affordable housing crisis. I mean, a housing affordability crisis where our market has been going up and up and up, and there isn't the supply of housing, in particularly in suburban communities, to sort of from a supply and demand standpoint to help moderate some of that price growth. So that's one issue. And the reason our housing supply is constrained a lot of times ties to our land use policies, our zoning regulations.
Mhm.
So that's one thing I would be interested in looking at
Okay.
is sort of, how can we, I think that what the values that are sometimes at odds when it comes to housing conversations are that exactly what you talked about, where it's like, what do we want to be a whole community, and at the same time, as a in the private market, you want your house value to be increasing. So that's seen
Exactly.
as a positive. And
Exactly.
I think the way we balance that, I mean, I think some of the things are that I think our very tight vacancy rate is actually not necessarily signs of a healthy market,
No,
because
it's
it
true.
is driving prices up artificially.
Exactly.
And so I think housing supply is again not an issue only for Melrose, but we're not exempt from that issue either. I think, I'm also concerned about where the market generally is going, in that if you adjust for inflation, we've exceeded housing prices from right before the 2005 the crash. The peak of the previous housing market was in 2005, and there was a crash that followed. So there's a part of me that's like, is this going to keep going up and up,
That's right.
or is it going to ideally
Stabilize.
stabilize, or is it going to crash?
Yes.
So there's that sort of the market piece of it.
Right.
But then on the other hand, I'm thinking about, we have, like everywhere, the baby boomer generation, a lot of folks are entering retirement. And as they do and go on fixed incomes, are they able to stay in their own community? Are they able to afford to live in a place like Melrose? And would they like to downsize? And do we have options for those folks to be able to be still part of the community life while also not having a large home to maintain? Or if they want to stay in their homes, do they have a way of, do they have support from the community to make the appropriate modifications for their home, or even just support from neighbors to have a strong community life still? Another thing I think about is, I mentioned renters.
Yes.
I know anecdotally, and I imagine the data would bear this out, but it's harder to get that data per se. I know anecdotally of a few very active community members that were renting and ended up having to move to one of our surrounding communities because they could not afford to stay in Melrose. They were priced out of our market
Yes.
when their lease, when they had to renew their lease. So I think supply is one thing we need to think about, and we are obviously constrained. Any development we would do is through redevelopment. I think again, there are ways to do that where we maintain the look and feel of the community while also asking some tough questions around, what is it that we value in terms of foot traffic in our downtown, in terms of revenue, in terms of tax revenue, and also in terms of preserving the character. And I think those are the things we have to grapple with as we deal with both the sort of commercial development side of things as well as housing. Another piece of the housing question is that we haven't even met our state obligation with regards to affordable housing.
Yes.
And I think there are ways we can be more proactive in that, although we've done a really great job of modifying some of our local regulations to help us get there. I think there's things that have been done, and I just want to have us focus more attention on some of the additional things that we can do.
Why do you think was this override issue so contentious in Melrose? What were the arguments of people who were resisting it? Well-meaning people, some of whom I meet at Dunkin' Donuts.
Yep.
In which I write every day.
I think on some level, people may already be feeling a pinch, and that idea of having to pay more taxes, it's hard to make that case no matter how good the argument is. Why? And then I think beyond that, there was questions around how that money is being used, and is it being used responsibly? Okay. I think going forward, what I would love to see is more accountability and more ways for the community to be aware of our budget setting process and have opportunities to advocate for what they want to see in the community. But also just like, I think, again, the way we do our budgeting process, I think with creating budgets that are that you don't need to be steeped in a series of spreadsheets to understand, that you can get kind of almost like an annual report type summary version, which a lot of those types of documents were produced through the override. And I want to see some of that accountability and transparency going forward.
What do you mean by accountability and transparency? Can you be specific without taking political risks?
So I think our budget documents, I know they take lots and lots of time to produce. I think as a mayor, one of the things I would like to bring to the table is I have a lot of experience in distilling down complex information into ways that are easier to consume, easier to understand, but not in a way where I think other people wouldn't be able to understand it. More, who has the time to sit and look at a 500-page series of, or it's not 500 pages, like 100 pages, but a series of spreadsheets to understand what's happening with our budget. But I think if a budget is a statement of local priorities, then the narrative, maybe some charts and graphs, some photographs, but also the numbers themselves, kind of creating a more clear picture of what's going on in the community, would be something that I would be interested in bringing to the table. I think more frequent communication, because again, my sense was a lot of the documentation that was being created during the override, there was sometimes a sentiment like, where is this coming from? Why is this a sudden crisis? Now, on the one hand, there was an effort to pass an override 4 years earlier before it became that same level of crisis. So that argument didn't totally hold sway with me. But what I did see is that I think we could be more clear of the trade-offs we make when we cut a position, or when we choose to fund our schools and weigh that with fixing our fire station or buying another fire truck. There's some tough choices that we have to make as a community. And I think a lot of those things happen through a pretty good process already. But I think that information isn't always well communicated, and the public isn't always invited into those conversations. And those are some of the things I'm thinking about.
Now, Let's focus on the schools for a while in the following way. How do you develop a budget that is sufficiently malleable and could accommodate A, increase of students, B, increase of teachers, C, proliferation of special needs, 4, expanding and creating spaces, such that the budget that you pass on this round might not be sufficiently rich to accommodate future changes. How do you envision the possibility of creating a sufficiently malleable budget that is future centered?
So I think we are still going to be constrained by our new level of funding revenue that we get through property taxes. So I think that additional 5.18 million that we're getting in this year, that will grow by 2.5% plus any new development we do. So I think part of it is, can we explore ways to grow that pot that aren't, that aren't necessarily through another override, and that might be where the development questions come in. I think this is where, as a city, we really have to identify what are our core values and what are the most important things. The things that make it really tough are state aid has been declining.
Yes.
A lot of the supports, I mean, some of these are obligations we have to meet when it comes to special education and in terms of per pupil spending. There are minimum thresholds we need to meet. And I think as a community, we want to go beyond the minimum. So I don't have a clear answer other than I think it's the combination of knowing we're still going to be in a constrained environment, but it won't be as constrained as it's been, where we were going to be shedding positions on the school side of the budget, but also the city hall side of the budget. We were going to be shedding a lot of resources if that override hadn't passed. Now we're at least more than stabilized, I would say, in terms of going forward. But I think those are going to be ongoing conversations that we need to be really level with the community on when it comes to future decision making.
Because I was just learning from the previous interview through a question that was sent to me by someone anonymously, that there is this $500 million that private developers are planning to spend on the city of Melrose. $500 million is quite substantial. These are private developers. I wish there was a way by which you as a mayor could begin to work with these private developers and then literally educate them morally to consider the possibility of not just focusing on extracting profit from massive buildings, but also extracting educated citizens by developing schools that produce good students, good teachers, good spaces, good environment, so forth and so on. This is just a dream question.
Well, we have a couple of mechanisms.
A dream question, in fact. A good mayor, in my judgment, not that I'm planning to run for one, I'm just speaking hypothetically, could envision the possibility of engaging private developers.
Absolutely.
What do you think?
So I think, I'm not sure where that 500 million figure comes from. A portion of that would be received by the city through taxation, right?
Correct.
So there's that at the beginning. But there are regulations. For example, we have an affordable housing incentive program, which we actually increased sort of the level of requirements for developers of larger buildings to provide a larger portion of the development project for affordable housing. So that's an example of the type of thing where that already exists in Melrose, where basically now developments over a certain size are required to provide a certain percentage or number of units on site. And then for every fractional unit, they have to pay into a fund So that's on the affordable housing
I
side.
see. Uh-huh.
I referenced some zoning I had worked on along the commuter rail corridor. And if there are developments there where they want to develop beyond what's already allowed in the district to use this overlay zoning,
Okay.
they are then also required to do some things in terms of the streetscape to make sure it's a pleasant environment that facilitates walking and biking. That they have, we can work into our zoning laws things about walking, biking, um, car share,
That's wonderful.
parking. All of these kinds of things already exist. And then I think beyond that, I think we have an opportunity to create. Again, these are not all new ideas. Some of these things already happen by the city, but maybe reinvigorating how we the process, making it clearer to both small business owners, but also maybe more profitable, larger developers and other business owners to understand our permitting and fee process.
Good.
And so that's like makes us business friendly on the one hand,
Exactly.
but on the other hand, creating a set of values and principles that we, there's certain laws we have to adhere to, obviously. Like we can't push things out per se,
Yes.
but I think through our regulation, how can we encourage certain types of development? And then I do think relationships, with developers, like, where we set those, like, here's what we're looking for if in our community, and can we work with you to find a solution that's win-win for us, as well as makes you want to do the development. Those
That's
are
excellent.
absolutely conversations.
I think I have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to give you these last 10 minutes to use them in any way you want. But let me first ask my last question, namely style, leadership style. What kind of mayor do you think are you going to be? What kind of style are you going to bring to the office?
Well, I want to be one thing I'm going to bring is, again, my planning experience, and what that I think is going to bring to the office is the ability to think about systems.
Yes.
And not just propose solutions that might seem like a good fix, but really look at the whole, why is something not working, and who are all the players, and how do we why isn't it working now? And is it a budget issue? Is it people aren't talking to each other? Is it even an issue at all? Like those kinds of things. I also will be, I'm collaborative. So I think one thing I've noticed is in talking with folks around the city is I have the ability of bringing people into the same room and having a conversation that they've maybe never had before, or maybe they have, but it's been in a more structured environment where I can sort of facilitate these conversations around, okay, here's our competing priorities as different departments who have different missions and different needs and answer to even different rules. So like, for example, our city auditor has best practices and standards that he follows. The fire department has best practices and standards that are recommended by, I forgot what the organization is, but they're, police, same thing. Superintendent follows the same thing. And sometimes you'd like to think all of those things are totally in lockstep with each other, but sometimes they are at odds. Different goals can be at odds. A concrete example I can give you is, again, I keep talking about walking and biking and being able to navigate the city.
I appreciate that.
And so there's been some roadway. We've talked about how it's at odds with parking sometimes. With another way is that we've made some roadway changes to help slow traffic down and maybe narrow the roads. So that is a great goal to facilitate walking and biking, and it's something I'm very much behind. But then I've also had conversations, for example, with the fire department where their trucks are struggling to get through, or they've seen an uptick in accidents. And how do we solve that? How do we still do the roadway treatments that will facilitate walking and biking while maybe trying to figure out how do we change driver behavior so there are fewer accidents,
I see.
which is challenging.
Very challenging.
But
Yes.
signage, I think those speed signs that say
Yes.
your speed is,
Your
and then it
speed
turns
is.
green when you
Yeah.
hit the right number.
It's disciplining me.
It
That is
helps. It helps.
working.
I mean, I think
Yeah,
it's
I'm
human
slowing
nature, right?
down. I
Like
have a
there's me as a
BMW.
driver and there's me as a
Yeah,
planner, and they're not always the same
that's
person,
wonderful.
right?
Yeah.
So, thinking about those kinds of things, I think my approach, and another thing is I really value public participation. So again, I know as mayor, I'm going to have to be in an executive decision-making role and have to make some really tough choices. But that to me doesn't mean it has to be at the expense of citizen engagement. And when I say citizen, I mean small c citizen community engagement.
Yes.
You don't have to be, to me, it's like you anybody who is within our Melrose community, whether you live here, you work here, you go to school here, is a part of our community. So how do we engage folks and help people feel like they really have a voice at City Hall, whatever your particular background is, walk of life, occupation, all of those things.
Yes. And finally, what kind of steps do you think could you undertake as a mayor to make Melrose attractive to people who look like you and me?
Having a mayor that looks like me would be a good start. I don't mean to be too, so one of the things, to rewind that for a second, one of the things that I have seen in my campaign for the first time I ran for office was, I wasn't running just to become the first ever person of color elected in Melrose. I was running because I cared about the city and because I wanted to see a certain vision, I guess, come to life. But one of the things I've seen is that because of the representation I add, people will come to me with their ideas that they may have never thought that they had representation in their local government. And now they see somebody who doesn't like look like them is like an overgeneralization, but whether I've had girls at the high school talk to me and say, before we knew you were on our city council, I thought someone like me with a different name could never run for office. Or before, I think I've had people get involved in my campaign that had never gotten involved in a local election. And that's not just, I guess, people of color. It's also, it's people of lots of different demographics. And just sometimes having somebody who values participation and engagement invites the participation and engagement. So I didn't mean to answer that in such a sort of flippant way initially, but
it's very well answered.
That's what I think. I think that will in and of itself create a feeling of welcome, as long as I am upholding those values.
Incredible.
As well.
And now for the rest of the program, I still think we have about 5-6 minutes left. What I want you to do from your heart is make a case for yourself why the city should elect you as a mayor. Take your time, develop an argument with all kinds of parts to it.
Sure. So I think we're a city that is facing some change. Again, we just talked about the override and how the conversations around the override brought up lots of different concerns in the community, whether you were for it or whether you were opposed to it. And I really want to tackle those things sort of head on. I think our changing demographics in terms of becoming a more diverse community, but also I think we're, facing some loss of socioeconomic diversity, really looking at those things as opportunities for us to think about how can we be more inclusive, how can we create new avenues of participation, but also make it economically viable for a diversity of people to continue to live here. Those are things that, again, with my experience, I can help bring to the table some initiatives around those types of priorities. I am in this work because I have had a lifelong passion for building community. I think a lot about, people. So before I won my first election, I had family members asking me, like, this is the thing that happens when you run for office. You haven't even gotten to the next step, and people will be projecting you out, I don't know, to like Congress or something, right?
Yes, of course.
And I remember having this conversation with my family saying, you know, maybe I'd be interested in a legislature role, but really, mayor is where my heart is at. Mayor is what draws on my experience in planning, really draws on my experience in community building, and gives me an opportunity to work with the community to enact a vision that we all can get behind. So I think, I mean, for me, it's really coming from the heart. I think I've told people like some of the things in my personal background before I became an alderman, before I became a candidate for mayor, where again, it feels like it just makes sense as the next step for me personally. Are, when I was in college, I was a resident assistant in the dorms, and it was like, not exactly like a mini mayor, but kind of where you're working with college freshmen who are there for the first time, who come from all kinds of different backgrounds, who are paired up with people they don't know to be roommates, who have to deal with different neighbors. So you're facilitating a good community within a dorm environment. Then you're creating programs to keep people engaged and get them interested. And then sometimes you're cleaning up after them, and you're trying to maintain good facilities and uphold certain values of your larger community. And so those are things that, again, that's an example of a job I've had way back in my past, when I was in college, that feels like there's a constant thread for me.
Which college was this?
So I actually did that particular role in both in my undergraduate studies as well as graduate school.
Which schools?
I went to the University of Iowa. So I grew up in Iowa. It's what everyone would guess, right? Just from looking at me, I'm from Iowa. And I went to the University of Iowa for my undergraduate studies. I got a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and Art. So again, this is where it's like I'm creative, but I also think about systems and
you're a calculator and a meditator.
Yes. And then I went to graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where
prestigious,
where I got a Master of City Planning degree. And again, at Penn, I was a resident assistant in both universities. And then at Penn, as a planning student, we had to do capstone projects where we're working with real life clients. And I remember another thing that makes me feel like mayor is the next step in my trajectory is that again, I kept picking the projects that were right in my own backyard in the university community as well.
And now you have 5 minutes left. Use it in any way you want. I need not ask you.
Sure. Well, so, I mean, I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk about some of the things I might do if elected. I've got a tough road ahead of me. The mayoral preliminary is September 17th. Nominations are still open. We currently have 4 candidates in the mix. Each of them brings a strong case to make as well. Although I feel mine is the strongest, but I have to really pound the pavement, talk to voters. I want to spend my next few months really talking to voters, understanding what is really important to you as a voter or as a community member, in terms of making Melrose the best it can be. And even though I've got my own ideas in that regard, I really want to hear from others. And that's what I'm going to be doing when I'm knocking on doors, when I'm at people's homes, talking to people who are interested in this election, or who maybe it wasn't on their radar, but someone invited them to a house party and now they're interested, that kind of thing. But I have my work cut out for me between now and September, where it's going to be narrowed down to the top 2 vote getters.
That's right.
And then after that, off to the races for the last 6 weeks until the general election.
I'm planning to interview all of them.
That's
now,
great.
Promise me, when you become a mayor, Are you going to allow us to give you a call? Are you going to be an accessible mayor? Or are you going to be the kind of mayor that we have to make appointments to see?
Um,
Are you going to be the people's mayor, accessible, friendly, unfrightening, unassuming, humble, and so on? Do you think?
I think my goal would be to have an open door policy. I think there is also sort of the reality of how does that actually play out in the day-to-day work. So I think it would be a combination of the doors in City Hall are
And the
open,
appointments.
but there will also be appointments. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't be welcoming, and that doesn't mean it would be only appointments, though, right? Like I want to have an open door,
I hope
but
that's
I also
important.
want to have things like maybe office hours or opportunities where I'm guaranteed to be there.
Of course,
I guess
I
that's kind of what I was
I
thinking.
understand.
When I said that.
It was a pleasure interviewing.
Thank you.
This has been your host, Kyoros Kiros, for African Ascent.